Close your eyes for a moment and picture a single London street in the middle of the 19th century. Not a famous one, not a grand boulevard, just a working street that could exist in 100 places across the city. Cobblestones worn smooth by boots and cartwheels, brick buildings pressed shoulder to shoulder, windows stacked above windows like a vertical puzzle of lives. I want you to stay on this one street with me, because today we're not chasing the whole city. We're standing still and letting London reveal itself floor by floor. The smell in the air is the same for everyone here, coal smoke and damp stone. But what that air means depends entirely on where you sleep at night. This is a story about two Londons occupying the same few yards of ground, divided not by distance, but by height, by money, and by whose suffering gets noticed. Before we go any further, if you're here for stories like this, the kind that slow down and let history breathe, hit subscribe now so you don't miss what's coming next. And take a second to comment where you're listening from, city, town or country. I read those, and it genuinely helps me remember that these streets don't just echo in London anymore, they travel much farther than that. Now let's step properly onto the pavement, because this street has a front door that tells one story and a back staircase that tells another, and most people in the 19th century never get to see both. At the western end of the street stands a house that announces success without shouting. It's not a palace, but it's confident. Clean brickwork, a solid front door painted dark and kept that way by regular care, tall sash windows that let in light instead of fear. This is the home of a factory owner, or perhaps a merchant tied to manufacturing, a man whose wealth is new enough to feel exciting but secure enough to feel deserved, at least in his own telling. Inside, the rooms are tall, the ceilings high enough that smoke from the fireplace can rise and thin out before it stings your eyes. Furniture is polished not just for display, but because someone else is paid to polish it. The floors are swept daily. Waste is discreet, removed by servants, carried out the back before it ever becomes a problem. Disease in this house is something you read about in the newspaper, something unfortunate that happens elsewhere, to other people, usually explained away as the result of bad habits or weak character. Now take just a few steps down the same street and slip through a narrow passageway that most visitors never notice. The buildings here are the same age, built of the same materials, but everything feels compressed. Light struggles to reach the lower floors. The air is thicker, heavier, and it doesn't move the way it does in the larger house. This is where the workers live, the men, women, and children whose labour keeps the factory owner's wealth flowing. Rooms here are rented by the week, sometimes by the day, often shared by multiple families, or by lodgers who rotate through shifts of sleep the way machines rotate through shifts of work. Ceilings are low, windows are small, and in winter they're kept shut to keep out the cold, trapping dampness and breath inside. This is where disease doesn't arrive as a rumour. It arrives as a cough that won't leave, as a fever that spreads from mattress to mattress, as a child who was running yesterday and is gone by the end of the week. What matters, and what I really want you to sit with, is that the air is technically the same. The smoke from the factory chimney drifts over both houses. The fog rolls down the street without checking who can afford to escape it. But the experience of that air couldn't be more different. Upstairs, in the owner's house, smoke is an inconvenience, something that dirties curtains and requires extra cleaning. Downstairs, in the workers' rooms, it mixes with breath and damp and filth until lungs begin to fail. When cholera stalks the city, it doesn't knock on doors equally. It rips through overcrowded rooms where clean water is scarce and waste is everywhere, while those with space, money and influence convince themselves they are safe, or at least safer. This is where the street becomes a kind of vertical map of inequality, The higher you climb, the healthier you are expected to be. The lower you sink, the more your illness is treated as inevitable. In many of these buildings, the poorest residents live at the very top, in attics where heat rises in summer and cold cuts deep in winter, or in cellars where damp seeps through the walls, and standing water becomes a permanent feature. Cellar dwellings are legal for much of the early 19th century, and they are death traps. Poor ventilation, no proper drainage, and flooding that turns rooms into foul pools after heavy rain. When disease strikes here, it spreads fast and kills quietly. There is no doctor waiting at the door. Medical care costs money and time, both in short supply. And when death comes, it barely registers beyond the building itself. Meanwhile, back in the factory owner's house, illness is framed as misfortune rather than destiny. If a child develops a fever, a doctor is summoned. If servants fall ill, they are dismissed or sent away before they become a risk. The owner's family may retreat to the countryside during outbreaks, literally leaving the street behind while the workers remain trapped in it. And this is one of the cruelest truths of industrial London. Mobility is health. The ability to leave, even temporarily, is often the difference between survival and death. The street doesn't change, but who is forced to endure it does. I want to slow down here and talk about how this inequality is justified at the time, because it isn't hidden. It's explained, defended, and reinforced. Many in the upper and middle classes genuinely believe that disease is a moral failing, that the poor are sick because they are lazy, dirty, or reckless. Overcrowding is blamed on personal irresponsibility, rather than on wages that cannot support decent housing. Filth is treated as a choice, not a condition imposed by poverty. This way of thinking allows the factory owner to walk past the same doorway every day without seeing the suffering inside as his problem. After all, he provides work. What happens beyond that, in his mind, is not his responsibility. And yet, this street binds them together more tightly than anyone wants to admit. When disease becomes widespread enough, it doesn't respect social boundaries as neatly as people hope. Servants carry illness between houses. Contaminated water doesn't stop at property lines. The same street that allows wealth to be displayed also allows infection to travel. This is when fear creeps upstairs, when newspapers begin to speak of epidemics not as distant events, but as immediate threats. Suddenly, sanitation becomes a topic of conversation, not because the poor are dying, but because the comfortable feel at risk. Standing on this street, you can almost hear the tension in the brickwork itself. Progress and neglect share walls. Wealth rises on foundations that are literally undermined by disease and decay. Reformers will eventually point to streets like this as evidence that the city cannot survive this way forever. But for now, in this moment, the imbalance feels permanent to those living it. If you're born into one of the upper floors, your life trajectory points upward or outward. If you're born into one of the lower rooms, the street feels like the whole world, and escape feels theoretical at best. What always strikes me, and what I hope stays with you, is how intimate this division is. This isn't rich and poor separated by miles. This is rich and poor separated by a staircase, by a door, by a social agreement not to look too closely. It's the same street, the same noise, the same smoke, and yet two completely different realities unfolding at the same time. This is London at its most revealing, not because it hides inequality well, but because it hides it in plain sight. If you're ready, we can keep walking this street together, deeper into how work, childhood and survival play out side by side in these buildings, and how the consequences echo far beyond their walls. When you stay on this street long enough, you begin to notice how time itself behaves differently depending on where you stand. For the factory owner, time is segmented and controlled. Mornings begin with breakfast laid out by someone else, newspapers neatly folded, the day framed by meetings, correspondence, and decisions that ripple outward. Work is something managed rather than endured. Evenings bring privacy, lamps lit behind thick curtains, rooms warm enough that winter feels like an inconvenience instead of a threat. Down the street and behind the walls, time is physical. It's measured in shifts, in aching joints, in how long a candle lasts before darkness swallows the room. For the workers, time is never abstract. It presses on the body constantly, and there is never quite enough of it. Work defines everything here, but not equally. The factory owner's wealth is tied to production, but his body is largely spared from it. He might visit the factory floor occasionally, boots, clean, coat brushed, presence brief and symbolic. For the men, women and children who live in the cramped rooms nearby, work is relentless and unavoidable. Factory bells dictate their lives, pulling them from sleep before dawn and sending them back late, exhausted, to rooms that barely allow rest. Children as young as 8, sometimes younger, contribute wages because families cannot survive without them. Childhood, as an idea, barely exists here. It's compressed into whatever moments remain after labour, often spent sleeping or recovering rather than playing. What's striking is how close the factory owner's comfort sits to this exhaustion. He can hear the same bell. He knows the same hours exist, and yet the experience is entirely separate. His prosperity is framed as the reward for risk and intelligence, while the worker's suffering is framed as the cost of progress. This mental separation is crucial. It allows the street to function without constant moral crisis if everyone acknowledged, fully and honestly, that one life is being traded for another's comfort. The system might become unbearable. So the division is maintained through distance of thought, not distance of space. Inside the workers' rooms, domestic life is shaped by scarcity. Cooking happens when fuel can be spared. Washing is done infrequently because clean water costs money or time, sometimes both. Clothes are worn until they nearly disintegrate, then patched and worn again. Privacy barely exists. Conversations, arguments, grief and joy spill into shared spaces. Illness spreads easily, and recovery is a luxury few can afford. Missing work because of sickness risks dismissal, and dismissal risks starvation. So people work through fevers, through coughs that shake their bodies, through injuries that never properly heal. The street absorbs this suffering quietly, without ceremony. Above it all, the factory owner's house remains an island of order. Servants smooth over. Discomfort before it becomes visible. Food is plentiful enough that weakness is rarely confused with hunger. Medical advice, while limited by modern standards, is at least accessible. When reformers talk about health, cleanliness and improvement, they often do so from rooms like these, insulated from the worst consequences of inaction. It's easier to debate theory when you're not coughing through the night or watching a child struggle to breathe. Death, when it comes, is handled differently too. In the owner's household, it's mourned privately, marked by black clothing and controlled rituals. Funerals are orderly, dignified affairs. Among the workers, death is frequent enough to feel almost routine, and that frequency dulls the response not because grief is absent, but because there's no space to process it. Bodies are laid out in the same rooms where the living sleep. Neighbours contribute what they can for burial costs. Children learn early that absence is normal. Someone is always missing. What makes this street especially brutal is how visibility works. The suffering of the poor is everywhere, but it is also easily ignored. It becomes background noise, part of the urban atmosphere like smoke or mud. People learn not to look too closely because looking too closely demands response. and response costs money, time, and comfort. So instead, the narrative hardens. The poor are described as naturally unhealthy, naturally prone to vice, naturally irresponsible. These stories protect the conscience of those who benefit most from the system. And yet, cracks form. Inspectors, doctors, and reformers begin to walk streets like this and record what they see. They note the overcrowding, the lack of ventilation, the standing water in cellars. They draw direct lines between environment and disease, challenging the idea that illness is purely moral. These reports don't immediately change lives, but they begin to change language. Disease starts to look less like punishment and more like consequence. Slowly, uncomfortably, the street becomes evidence. The factory owner cannot remain entirely untouched by this shift. Even if he never sets foot in the workers' rooms, the conversation reaches him. Cholera outbreaks don't stay politely confined. Fear has a way of making empathy practical. When health becomes a shared concern, reform becomes possible, but it is rarely generous. Improvements are often made not out of compassion, but out of self-preservation. Better drainage, cleaner water, improved housing standards are debated because the alternative begins to look dangerous for everyone. Still, for the people living at the bottom of this street, change comes painfully slowly. Each reform takes years to implement, and even longer to reach the poorest residents. In the meantime, lives continue much as before. Babies are born into rooms already too full. Wages fluctuate, rent rises, and security remains fragile. Hope exists, but it's cautious, shaped by experience. People learn not to expect too much from promises made above their heads. What holds this street together, despite everything, is not harmony, but endurance. People adapt because they must. They form communities within buildings, share resources, watch each other's children, mourn together. These bonds don't erase hardship, but they make survival possible. It's important to remember this, because focusing only on suffering risks stripping people of agency. The poor of this street are not passive victims. They are active participants in lives constrained by forces far larger than themselves. As we keep walking, the street begins to reveal something else, something quieter but just as powerful. The way these unequal lives shape the future of the city itself. The choices made here, the compromises, the neglect, and the small acts of resistance all ripple outward. If you're ready, we can keep following those ripples and see how streets like this force London to confront itself. By the time you've spent enough hours on this street, you start to realize that it isn't just a backdrop for inequality, it's an engine that quietly manufactures it, day after day. Every decision made within these buildings reinforces what comes next. Rent rises not because rooms improve, but because demand never stops. Wages stay low because there is always someone desperate enough to accept them. The factory owner doesn't need to enforce cruelty directly. The structure of the street does most of the work for him. It narrows choices until survival itself becomes a form of obedience. One of the most painful contrasts here is how childhood unfolds. In the owner's house, children are prepared for futures imagined long before they can articulate them. Education is an investment. Time is allowed for growth, for learning, for mistakes that don't permanently scar. Illness is a setback, not a verdict. On the other side of the street, childhood is something squeezed into the margins. Learning happens informally, if at all. Many children can read only enough to follow instructions or tally wages. Their bodies are shaped early by labour, their spines bent, their lungs filled, their hands roughened before they fully understand what they're trading away. When disease strikes here, it doesn't just interrupt a life, it often ends one before it properly begins. What's unsettling is how normalised this becomes. Neighbours grow used to small coffins. Employers grow used to replacement. The street absorbs loss the way it absorbs smoke, thickly and without pause. This is where statistics begin, long before anyone writes them down. Infant mortality, life expectancy, occupational death rates, they all start as faces and names on streets like this, slowly abstracted into numbers that feel safer to discuss than the reality they represent. And yet, this street is not silent. Voices rise, sometimes literally from windows, sometimes through petitions, strikes, and public meetings. Workers talk to each other. They compare wages, hours, conditions. They notice patterns. The same diseases appear again and again in the same buildings. The same families seem permanently trapped, while others rise without ever touching a machine. Awareness doesn't immediately create power, but it creates memory. And memory is dangerous to systems built on forgetting. The factory owner hears these murmurs whether he wants to or not. They arrive as complaints, as threats of unrest, as rumours of organisation. Sometimes they arrive as broken machinery or slowed production. This is where fear changes sides. The street that once quietly delivered labour now begins to feel unpredictable. Control becomes a priority. Surveillance increases. Rules tighten. Respectability is emphasised as a dividing line, a way to separate the deserving from the undeserving poor. Charity is offered selectively, reinforcing hierarchy even as it appears generous. Health reform enters this moment like an argument no one can fully escape. Reports circulate describing conditions in graphic detail. Words like ventilation, drainage, and contagion move from medical circles into public debate. The idea that the environment shapes health becomes harder to dismiss when evidence piles up. Streets like this become case studies. Maps are drawn showing disease clustered where poverty is densest. The illusion that sickness is purely moral begins to fracture under the weight of data. Still, implementation lags far behind understanding. Laws are passed slowly, unevenly enforced, and often resisted by those who would bear the cost. Improving housing cuts into profits. Cleaning streets requires public spending. Providing clean water means infrastructure that doesn't pay immediate dividends. So progress arrives unevenly, sometimes stopping halfway up the street. A new sewer line here, a condemned cellar there. Enough improvement to claim success, not enough to eliminate suffering. For the people living through it, this partial progress is both hope and frustration. Conditions improve just enough to suggest change is possible, but not enough to guarantee safety. Disease becomes less frequent, but no less feared. Families cling to small victories while remaining one illness away from disaster. The street begins to feel transitional, suspended between an old brutality and a promised future that never quite arrives on time. What fascinates me most, standing here, is how memory works. The factory owner's children grow up hearing stories of hard beginnings, of risks taken and rewards earned. The workers' children grow up hearing stories of endurance, of losses survived, of injustices quietly noted. These parallel histories shape how the next generation understands the street. One sees opportunity, the other sees constraint. Both are true, but only one is widely celebrated. As evening settles in, lamps flicker to life unevenly along the street. Some windows glow warmly, others barely light the room at all. Sounds change. Laughter drifts from one house. Coughing echoes from another. The factory falls silent, but the consequences of its work linger in bodies and breath. This is when the street feels most honest, stripped of the daytime performance of productivity. What remains is life as it actually is, uneven, unfair, and deeply human. And this is where the story tightens, because streets like this don't just reflect inequality. They force decisions that shape what London becomes next. Pressure builds. Tolerance wears thin. The city reaches a point where ignoring these contrasts becomes more dangerous than addressing them. Eventually, this street reaches a moment where it can no longer carry its contradictions quietly. The pressure that's been building for decades, the sickness, the overcrowding, the anger, the fear, all of it begins to demand resolution. Not all at once, and not cleanly, but unmistakably. Public health crises force the issue. Epidemics that start in the poorest rooms spill outward, and suddenly the language of blame loses its usefulness. When wealth can no longer fully insulate itself, the street becomes impossible to ignore. Reform stops being a moral debate and starts becoming a practical necessity. This is where the machinery of change finally grinds into motion. Laws regulating housing conditions are strengthened. Cellar dwellings are restricted and eventually banned in many areas. Local authorities are given more power and more responsibility to inspect, condemn and rebuild. Clean water systems expand. Sewers are improved. Streets are widened, sometimes brutally so, with entire neighbourhoods erased in the name of progress. For the factory owner, these changes feel disruptive but manageable. For the workers, they feel like a double-edged sword. Health improves, but rents rise. Stability increases, but displacement becomes a real threat. Reform, it turns out, has its own costs. What's important to understand is that these changes don't come from a sudden awakening of compassion. They come from pressure, from streets like this one pushing back, simply by existing in a state that becomes too dangerous to maintain. The poor don't suddenly gain power overnight, but their suffering becomes too visible, too measurable, too costly to dismiss. The city adapts not because it wants to be kind, but because it wants to survive. And yet, even that imperfect motivation saves lives. The street itself begins to change character. Some buildings are renovated, others demolished. Families move, sometimes by choice, often by force. The factory owner's house may remain, or it may be converted, subdivided, absorbed into a different kind of London entirely. The workers' rooms may be replaced with new housing, or pushed farther out as the city expands. Inequality doesn't disappear. It rarely does, but it rearranges itself, finding new forms, new streets, new ways to coexist with progress. What lingers longest is memory. Long after the buildings are altered, the patterns remain. Health outcomes, life chances, and social mobility continue to map themselves unevenly across the city. The street teaches London a lesson it never fully forgets. Proximity does not equal equality. You can live side by side and inhabit completely different worlds. And unless those worlds are actively bridged, the consequences don't stay contained. When I walk modern London, this is what I think about. Not just the grand landmarks or the polished facades, but the invisible layers beneath them. Streets like this one are everywhere if you know how to look. In the way, housing prices climb floor by floor. In the way, pollution affects some lungs more than others. In the way, opportunity still clusters and withholds. The past doesn't sit behind us neatly. It runs alongside us, reshaped but familiar. What makes this story hit hardest, at least for me, is how ordinary it all was. No single villain, no dramatic collapse, just millions of daily decisions stacked on top of one another. A landlord raising rent, an employer cutting costs, a family working through illness because they have no alternative. These small choices build entire systems. And once built, those systems feel natural, even inevitable, until a street like this exposes how fragile and constructed they really are. This is why I wanted to tell this story from one street, not an entire city. because history often feels distant when it's abstract, but it becomes uncomfortable when it's specific. One pavement, one staircase, one set of lungs breathing the same air and living a very different life. That closeness forces us to confront the reality that inequality isn't just about wealth. It's about whose suffering we are willing to see and whose we quietly step around. If you've stayed with me all the way through this walk, thank you. These stories matter because they shape how we understand the world we're standing in right now. And if this kind of slow, deep history is something you want more of, stay with the channel. We'll keep walking these streets together, listening carefully, and pulling stories out of places most people pass without noticing.